interesting. So why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself?
So I am 37 years old. I grew up in the Lutheran Church. So Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which is, of all the spectrum of Lutheran churches, we're a pretty conservative one. I went to a Lutheran middle school up through 8th grade and then a public high school. And it was kind of my early 20s. I actually got really interested in sort of like Eastern philosophy, Buddhism, meditation. I did some martial arts, stuff like that. And those ideas kind of always resonated with me, but I always still made, the Pascal's wager of the Protestant, my hope is in Jesus for my salvation. And that never changed. I almost wonder, looking back, if there's not a parallel between like my interest in some of those other religions and other people at that same time finding their way into atheist materialism, like a crisis of faith. They go through college and encounter new ideas, things like that. Long story short, I met my wife when I was in my first year of dental school. We got married pretty quickly after we met. We were both really interested in kind of the Protestant Christian world. And so Mark Driscoll was really big at the time. We listened to a lot of Driscoll sermons, got really familiar with a lot of that content. And because of that, we sort of moved away ideologically from the Lutheran Church, even though we were still attending. And now we go to a non-denominational church, which there's sort of a denomination to the non-denom churches. We go to sort of a mini mega church, if you will. And more recently, and it wasn't since I've encountered like Jordan Peterson's ideas, especially, they resonate with me as like a person who really likes science. And Jonathan Pageau, especially. I've got my Jonathan Pageau shirt on for this, as you can see, some Pageau merch. And just tying this whole thing together, these ideas from these sort of Eastern, mystical ideas tied into Christianity, we've both been really intrigued by Orthodoxy, and some of the doctrine seems to make a lot of sense. And I was really just hoping to get your take on that phenomenon as a Protestant pastor. And the reason I wanted to reach out to you specifically, and I have to personally say thank you for the content you're doing, the work that you're doing. I don't see anybody else with a Protestant background in a committed Protestant church sort of exploring the space and interacting with these thinkers. And so again, personally, not just from me, but your whole community, a genuine thank you to the work you're doing.
Thank you. Yeah. Gosh, it's, so of course I found Jordan Peterson. I think he was mentioned in a Rod Dreher blog. And of course, once I was reading Rod Dreher to one degree or not, I was already sort of adjacent to this thing, because of course that's Dreher's path. He went there earlier. And then Jordan Peterson, and how Peterson was addressing, and again, when I think back, I didn't quite know why I was intrigued by him. I had some inclinations, and then very quickly people are like, oh, you should talk to Jonathan Pageau. I could barely pronounce the dude's name. And I watched a couple of his videos. I was like, I have no idea what's going on with this guy.
Yeah.
And so then I spoke with John a couple of times, and continuing with these rando slots and conversations. And then the Discord, the guys from my local meetup here started the Discord. And, then suddenly all of these people sort of wandering over to Orthodoxy, or curious about Orthodoxy, or exploring Orthodoxy. And that was interesting. I had, a number of years before, I had read Molly Worthen's book on Apostles of Reason, which was kind of a treatment of the neo-evangelical movement in the 50s and 60s, Carl F. Henry, Billy Graham, Fuller Seminary. And there's a couple interesting passages in that book where there were earlier waves of Orthodox curious that went through the church as well. And I noted that. And then one of the church planters in the area, so then when I was here in Sacramento, we were doing church planting. And so then we would tend to get guys straight out of seminary And when we started that, it was still toward the end of the, the mega church, non-denominational seeker movement. But within a few years, a lot of the younger guys in their church plants were doing typed out liturgy, weekly communion. And they, one of them was talking about orthodoxy, and it's like,
wow,
what's going on here? And of course, now since the Randos conversations and the Jordan Peterson stuff, I'm fairly neck deep into it. And I haven't done a lot of conversing with Orthodox priests. I've had some invitations from some of them, and just scheduling it never really worked out. I guess the main questions I have still are, number one, to what degree is this wave going to be a redux? In other words, you have Orthodox immigrants coming over, especially since the fall of the Soviet Union, and so you've got all these immigration reopened to the United States, to the degree that here in Sacramento, there's a significant Slavic, Ukrainian, Russian population that when my son, who actually kind of looks like you, when he was in high school, he had long hair, and he went to the local public school, and he was known to be white, not Russian, because there are so many Russians around that they had to distinguish.
Oh, wow.
The whites, the non-Russians from the Russian whites.
Yeah, right.
And many of them who came to Sacramento were actually evangelicals, which was fascinating. So there's sort of old country, old world orthodoxy that's been in America. Now, Jonathan Pageau, when he comes to orthodoxy through French Canadian, his parents went evangelical. Now he's in orthodoxy. Another friend who came through the Discord, she was a Protestant missionary in Africa. She came back to North America, met someone via the Discord server, and is, pursuing orthodoxy. I've had a number of conversations off camera with couples and individuals who are exploring it. My conversation with Sally, that was on the channel, so who was again pursuing orthodoxy. I'm sort of waiting to see what happens longer term with many of these people coming in with this wave into orthodoxy. How many will stick? Because I think some will, they're excited, it's new. It resolves a bunch of tensions and questions that are sort of within Augustinian Protestantism. So Nathan Jacobs, who I had conversations with early on, who went to my alma mater, got a PhD at Calvin Seminary, and then went Orthodox. Be really curious to know what my professors think about that.
Sure.
So, and he seems very, he's an artist. He seems very much at home. I think some who are going there will stick. It'll stick, and they'll stay there productively and happily. I think others who go there will find, well, again, every church is different too. So some are going to have real synergy with their priest, and there's going to be good synergy with the community. Others, it might not work. And so they might wind up Roman Catholic. They might go back to some Protestant church. So I'm really just kind of watching and waiting. And I understand why Orthodoxy, a good number have also been sort of gone Roman Catholic, and sometimes Eastern Rites Catholic groups, or, things like that.
Sure.
But I'm of the opinion, generally speaking, that there's no real simply going back. Every time you sort of go back, it's also forward, because everything that's happened, you're going to bring into that space. And so it's going to be a new mix, and it might be a great mix.
Sure.
But it's not going to be what Burn Power is finding in Tbilisi, Georgia. It's going to be different.
Sure. Right. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Because that was my thoughts on Protestantism is, and I think I want to take credit for the idea, maybe I can't, but I remember saying before I heard Peugeot say it, that Protestantism is kind of steeped in this Western Enlightenment rationalism with some supernatural addenda added on to explain the questions that we can't answer. And I feel like almost as soon as you cede that territory, it sort of lays the groundwork for scientism, because the way we look at it, and the argument I've heard, and I think it's a fairly plausible argument that atheists make, is they say we've got two baskets. There's a basket of natural things and a basket of supernatural things. And over the last 100 years, we've been able to take things out of the supernatural basket and put it in the natural basket. And humans like trends. We think trends are truth. It's funny. My brother-in-law is a financial planner and shared with me the statistic that traders on average that actively trade their portfolios underperform the market average. And I think the reason is we see these trend that goes up. We try to jump on it and then we get burned. And, so the parallel would be, we see this trend of things moving from supernatural explanations to natural explanations. So the argument that naturally follows is, look, eventually we're going to empty out this supernatural basket. And apologetics, and I was really into apologetics for a while, like William Lane Craig and those guys, their sort of mode of operating is to say these things in the supernatural basket have to stay here. There's no rational way we're going to be able to take them out. And I think that's a decent exercise in the culture that we're in. But what I've seen in Orthodoxy that I haven't seen in Protestantism, and would be curious to hear your thoughts if this is something we could bring into Protestantism, is this idea of a whole worldview, a system that's a whole worldview, a way through which we view the world. Like the natural world is an extension of the meaning that underlies it, rather than meaning being, epiphenomenal to naturalism, which again, I don't think we would say that as Protestants, but I don't think we interact with that idea enough on the whole.
I think that's right. Part of, when I now 4 years later look back and ask myself, what intrigued me about Jordan Peterson? It was that he was trying to resolve what might be called Cartesian dualism. That's how Vervaeke usually phrases it. Peugeot is clearly trying to lay out or explicate an integrated worldview where spirit isn't reliant upon a separate substance than matter, material substance, to have the world connect. And so not only will all of these former evangelicals and Protestants coming into the Orthodox Church change orthodoxy in America, but orthodoxy in America is going to change Protestant churches too. I mean, it's going to go both ways, and that's already happening. And that was happening, a decade before I found Jordan Peterson, and we've had these conversations here. We're seeing the process underway. Now, part of the new atheist assault was, like you said, I think you said it really nicely, we're skeptical about what's in the supernatural basket. There's only one basket. And so what you have on the other end of that is now Peterson and Peugeot saying, yeah, you're right, there's only one basket. But these things that are in the supernatural basket, you're not getting rid of that. In fact, the things in this other basket that you're relying on, those are actually dependent upon the one basket is nested in the other.
Exactly.
And that conversation. So I just finished a really interesting conversation. I hope he decides to share it. And we touched on the issue of scale, which is what I'm always pushing Vervaeke on, that this is going to have to get down to people with low IQs, people who's never going to watch videos, moms, women, busy people who have no time for any of this esoteric jargon.
Right.
That happens through the church. It takes a while but it is happening. And usually what happens in the culture is that these pressures that you and I are feeling, and we're talking our way through it, and as a community, we're sort of digesting it. Those pressures are also on people who are not paying any attention to this conversation. And so there's actually adjustments that they're undergoing too, that we're going to begin to see. And I mean, this is how things actually change cultures. So it's coming. And I, again, as I've said many times, I have zero problem with people pursuing orthodoxy, because number one, it's Christianity. Number two, I think the Orthodox Church in America is going to bless the larger American church by bringing to America access to certain theologies and a heritage that, for the most part, in America started almost uniformly Protestant.
Mm-hmm.
And then Catholics have been sort of coming in and having a powerful impact, especially in the last 50 years. And now it's the Orthodox turn. They're going to come in. And America has always sort of been this, it is in many places, or in many ways, a religious melting pot, where the treasures from Orthodoxy are going to be brought into the conversation, and that will change Catholicism in America, and it'll change Protestants. And then what happens usually is some of these new things, these are going to go out to the rest of the world, because America is such a cultural leader in the world, and that's going
Mm-hmm.
to be diffused out into mission movements in Africa and Asia, just as those movements are now also coming back to America. America is sort of this pot in which it spills out into the rest of the world, but the rest of the world also contributes to it. And
Sure.
so it's a very dynamic system. And Orthodoxy's an important part to play in that, I think, right now.
That's really fascinating, that point about how the influences happen slowly, but you kind of have to get down to the ground level in order to do that. Do you see technology changing the way that plays out? And so the background I would give to that question is, for example, the printing press, where ideas sort of became something else. They're almost tangible, because you by holding, you can hold paper. I can almost hold an idea, and I can share the idea and so there's almost this, I wonder if with the advent of the printing press, and Enlightenment rationality, if those two things kind of came on together as part of the same idea. And I could be wrong on this. It's just something I'm sort of thinking of in the moment. But the idea that we can write and share ideas, now all of a sudden those ideas themselves have more value than they would in the abstract. And so now that information is so liquid that we have algorithms that are sort of manipulating the way we think about things, if there will be some other pressures to rearranging the way that we think about the world, or if it's such a strong phenomenon for things to change at the ground level, that communication like this will be able to kind of supersede any technological influences.
Well, I think the technological influences are going to come part and parcel with it. I mean, even now, I think about this often, because I'm always sort of torn between investing my time and energy in YouTube
Mm-hmm.
versus, let's say, writing. Because before YouTube, I did a lot more writing, and since YouTube, I've done less writing, and they're very different media.
Mm-hmm.
But if I were writing these things in a book, it wouldn't have my voice. It wouldn't
Sure.
have my beard. It wouldn't have my bad habit of not finishing my sentences. It wouldn't have the pathos that I bring at times in video.
Sure.
Or even just in audio. So yeah, this is gonna be a big change. And even with respect to the questions of orthodoxy. So Sunday morning, I was getting ready for church, and for some reason I usually spend Sunday morning getting ready for church, not just in terms of dressed and everything, but getting my messages polished off and planned out. But somehow I opened up YouTube, and right there was both the Oklahoma City Orthodox Church live streaming, and right below it, Madison Square Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan, a church I used to attend. They were live streaming. So I dropped into both live streams, and obviously they're vastly different in that the Protestant church, the preacher was there, the stage was there. It's very Protestant. The Orthodox church, it was very Orthodox. The cantor was going through the liturgy. The camera was static. You could see the walls, the lighting. And I thought, it's easier to go to church online in Protestantism by virtue of the shape of the Protestant Reformation and the printing press.
Yes, 100%.
Than just having a camera in an Orthodox church listening to the cantor doesn't make for good TV.
Right.
So but now yet it's so funny because I really have to dig up the clip of Nathan Jacobs, because one of the things that I learned from him very early on was part of the value of Orthodoxy that he eventually embraced was he sees all this innovation that happened after Augustine. And of course, Luther, Calvin very much follow Augustine. The Protestant Reformation is deeply Augustinian. Nathan Jacobs had a lot of critique of Augustine. And so, really valued the Orthodox because they've maintained the message. Okay, fair enough. And actually, Protestantism is an entire effort to reclaim a message that they believe all kinds of other things had affixed onto it. And so it was very much a primitivist impulse. We're going to get back to but Orthodoxy is similar in that way, because they're saying, no, we've not only maintained the theology or the principles. I've heard Orthodox preachers basically throw, in fact, book, just throw that out. But it's all in the liturgy. We've maintained the liturgy, but you're doing it in English.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And so that is not in that sense, Mr. Orthodox, you're post your own Vatican II, because you're doing it in English, and you've had to adapt to have it intelligible in America. And those adaptations are not inconsequential. And so all of those tensions we're going to be sifting through. And as people who have, let's say, gone the whole full gamut, so they were raised in church, and then in early adolescence, they threw the thing off and they listened to all kinds of Sam Harris, and then they jumped on the Jordan Peterson bandwagon, and then they found Peugeot, and now they're seeking an Orthodox church. All of those steps are still built into them. And they're going to bring all of that into the Orthodox church. And the Orthodox, at least that I'm aware of, are plenty internet savvy.
Sure.
You're wearing Orthodox merch.
Yeah, right. 100%.
So that's not nothing. And I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying all of this is part of the process. And Orthodoxy has and will continue to change too, but differently than, the big evangelical church, when they hear that podcasts are the hot thing. So Mark Driscoll leans into podcasting and, all of that stuff. So I'm just aware of all this stuff, and I'm fascinated to watch it all develop, because it's gonna happen, and the technology is going to impact it. And again, the conversation that I did with Sally, where she was so frustrated at her Orthodox parish because they basically closed down, and
I watched that one. That was,
yeah,
that was great.
and so there she's sitting with her Orthodox study Bible out on her front lawn, and she's like, I'm a Protestant again.
Right, right.
Because she doesn't
Yes.
want to submit to her priest.
Mm-hmm.
And that submission is part and parcel of the whole package. Whereas the Protestants tend to be, this is a voluntary association, come or don't come. And all of that stuff is built into the political, the religious culture of America, voluntarism. So it's a very live experiment. And I think it's a happy one, but we're all going to find out stuff that surprises us, some good, some bad.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely fascinating. I know exactly what you're saying with that. And I've thought the same thing, that Protestantism, there's an ethos there that's very American, individualistic, even to, the criticism Protestants often get, which is you're allowed to interpret scripture for yourself. Sola scriptura, it's what I read. And there's sort of a individual element to that. And I think that would be, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe Orthodoxy's critique of even these influences entering Orthodoxy itself, that there could be some good ideas that come in, but they're going to bring things in with them. This idea of being able to choose your own adventure, so to speak. And that's along the lines of what you said with the YouTube thing. And that's kind of, I think, what I was trying to touch on, this idea that the Protestant church in Grand Rapids makes for better TV than the Orthodox church. And so the medium is not entirely agnostic to the thing that it's piping through. And so natural selection will, if we have our church has better lights, or we have better lighting, our theology all of a sudden is going to have a little bit more credibility in that medium, because it's going to reach more people. These ideas are going to resonate. They're going to be discussed. Whereas the Orthodoxy, that might not be the case. And again, I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's, like you said, it's kind of a fascinating part of this whole experiment.
Yeah. Well, and people sometimes don't see that, the dome with Christ on it,
Mm-hmm.
that's a technology. That's, in many ways, that's Roman. I don't mean Western Roman, because the Easterns considered themselves Roman. The dome, that's all technology. And the art, the frescoes or the mosaics, that's all technology. It doesn't, we're not born into the world with frescoes and domes and
Sure.
and icons. They're of a period, and the period is again not incidental. And so,
Mm-hmm.
if you listen to, say, Jonathan Peugeot's origin story, he's in art school. When he decides to get into icons, he's going to intentionally and specifically choose traditional iconography,
Mm-hmm.
because there's contemporary iconography, and Jonathan Peugeot turned away from that. So that's a very primitivist, originist movement. But even once we put our choice in and our preference in, it's hard not to choose in 2021 and not enact a consumerist spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Which again, when some begin, well, I'm going to choose Orthodoxy. Are you going to still choose it when your priest says, we're closing because of COVID, or everybody needs to wear a mask, or nobody's allowed to wear a mask? I mean, are you really going to submit to your priest? And what if the priest in this parish and the priest in this parish are not on the same page? And then, how does that respond to the hierarchy or their bishops? And I mean, you don't really escape these questions. And again, that's not to say that the questions are bad, but it's there. We always, and this is deeply within Protestantism, because, with Luther, wow, now via the printing press, now via Erasmus, we have an opportunity to do better than Saint Jerome and the Vulgate.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to get at the text itself. And once we get at the text itself, then all of these other questions that are plaguing us about relics and indulgences and corruptions in the clergy and all of this other stuff, that's going to sweep everything away. Well, it didn't. And so neither will deciding I'm going to undo the Protestant Reformation and I'm going to undo the Great Schism and I'm going back to the liturgy that seems to have the closest DNA connection to the Apostle Paul. Well, you're going to do it in Greek. And the last I read the New Testament, Paul didn't leave us a liturgy. Well, I'm going to go back to Chrysostom. Oh, okay. That's fine. But Chrysostom was not Paul, and there were a number of centuries between them. So the impulse of always trying to get behind or underneath or around, there's reason for that, but I don't find it compelling to say, okay, then now I'm at the quintessential.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I remain skeptical.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. Like, especially like you said, those problems that exist in Orthodoxy, they're so visible in Protestantism that in contrast, it looks like, well, it doesn't look like they're dealing with the same issues. But the interview, is Sally, do I have that right?
Yeah.
That interview, that was really enlightening for me when she said, yeah, I'm Protestant, sitting in my wife and I watched that together and, laughed at that part. Regarding technology, I think I'm trying to formulate this in the moment. I think where I may push back a little bit on the idea of the fresco and the dome being technology is that it's still limited in material space-time. So you have a certain amount of people that takes a certain amount of time and a certain amount of physical resources to construct this dome or these frescoes. Whereas nowadays, the technology has two major differences. One is it's leveraged. And so the counterpart would be, we could have one artist that, if 1,000 years ago, this one artist could make 10,000 frescoes and distribute them throughout the region. Now we have, that's the fresco. That's the idea. These ideas are more, viral, so to speak, than there's almost some value in it being limited in material space-time in that way. And then the second part is almost this, as technology trends forward, it looks like there's, what the tech companies want is our attention. They want our psychology. They don't care as much about where our physical bodies are, where we're present. And so their aim is to get at our psychology. And I think a side effect of that is, especially with, this metaverse and all this stuff, there's this separation of physical space from where you are emotionally or mentally. And so a church service that streams online, there's just, I know Pajot would say that there's something that's just not the same thing about not being present with that. And so that's where I'm really concerned about what technology does and whether there are some bad ideas baked into the cake that are, more or less inevitable coming down the pipe. And again, I hope I'm wrong about that, but we'll, it'd be interested to see how it plays out.
Oh, I think your concerns are very valid, and those differences between something tangible versus, I can touch the screen right now, but that's very different from touching an icon or touching a fresco,
Mm-hmm.
Or even touching a book. So no, those are very real and point taken. That's very true. And even some of the studies on children and screens.
Yeah.
And Pajot himself said, and he's a, bigger YouTuber than I am. He's, we're these beings of light, and this is monkeying with a lot of things that we don't really understand. Could it be that someday we're going to treat all of these screens with a great deal more care? And, it's not uncommon in certain especially before COVID, to go into a store or a restaurant, and here's an entire family, toddlers included, sitting down, scrolling through things on iPads and phones, and what's happening to us. So yeah, that's very real. And there's an element of participation and context in a building with a dome and with icons and a fresco that there isn't with, you walk into the sanctuary here and there's a big TV up front. The TV up front was just economic for us to, here are the words. And the church plant that is now using our space too with us, I mean, they're using paper, and although they also have it on the screen. And when I was with them for their ordination service, and I found myself using the screen and not the paper for various reasons. So no, those are all good points. And we just don't know. But yet, the Oklahoma City Orthodox Church, they've got that camera up. They're live streaming.
Yeah.
And so suddenly you have this choice. Well, do you say, well, we're going to turn our back on this completely and not live stream our Sunday morning services? You can do that. And you can say, no, we're going to be really disciplined and insistent upon, if you don't get down here physically and participate, we're going to be purists in that sense. And I have respect for that. But that also always comes at a cost.
Yeah.
Because then suddenly all kinds of other options are forestalled. And
sure, I think there may be just an element of living in that tension. I mean, it must, day to day, there are hard decisions to make in regard to that. I think that's maybe a good way to look at it. Did you catch the New York Times article that Facebook wants to get involved with hosting religious services? I thought that was pretty fascinating.
No.
So it's this idea with the metaverse, which I have a lot of thoughts on that. I'm kind of a tech nerd and VR and all that stuff, but this metaverse, now they want to get it so they want to host religious services, which I think is probably one of the worst ideas I've heard in quite a while. Just in terms of, you have this commercial entity through which flows the communication of, priests and parishioners and congregants with each other. And it's I can't remember when it came out, but
I just pulled it up in front of me. July.
Yeah.
Oh my. Well, part of, so I've got these two conversations today, but I'm always thinking, my videos are usually just because I'm thinking about stuff. And then it's like, can I actually formulate this enough to explain something? I'm just going to throw this up on my blog so I can find it later.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And I was just listening to the Rebel Wisdom treatment of the Beatles documentary that came out. And early on, I forget Todd Armstrong made the point about how, the Beatles in some ways began, took music, almost up there into the religious register.
Sure.
Exactly say it that way. I mean, obviously Facebook is interested in this because they have the data and they know, new atheists notwithstanding, they know how popular religion is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if porn is king on the internet, religion is number 2.
Sure.
And so just from a business point, they're like, if we could really get into the religious game, that's a lot of money. And I think, one of the YouTube knows this. And part of, YouTube is, Google is always sort of walking this line in terms of, their politics versus how much of the countercultural stuff do we, not the popular countercultural, which really isn't countercultural, but the kinds of channels that get demonetized and,
sure,
those are the countercultural ones.
Sure.
And but there's always a bit more tolerance for the overtly religious. And I think
Yeah.
part of that is these corporations know you cut out the religion, it's death to your business model.
Right. Right.
And religion is this, is like this very deep cultural layer that, I mean, the new atheists were just plain wrong. It is,
Yeah.
all of their stuff is nested in religion.
Right. Yeah.
And but to think about Facebook, I mean, they're already changing. We stream our service. So when we went to COVID, we actually were doing it before too, but we upped it in some ways. So we stream the service on our website, on YouTube, and on Facebook. And I eventually thought, yeah, we're going to stop streaming on Facebook once we really get YouTube and the website up. But no, I very quickly realized we couldn't.
Yeah. Same with our church.
Because Facebook is where the people are. And
Right.
I've been getting rid of junk here at church using Facebook Marketplace, and I never used it before, but my daughters are like, use Facebook Marketplace. And so they're not dumb. They know, they have the data. But to think about Facebook, the church of Facebook.
Yeah. And to me, that was it. And I wouldn't even assign a bad intent to whoever's making those decisions. No. I think it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what religion is. I think that they would see religion as a community exercise, and that they are very well versed at facilitating communication between people. And so this is an obvious next step. And I think that's maybe kind of what I was trying to hint at earlier with these sort of bad ideas that are just baked into the cake of social media. This could be one of them. This idea that religion is just about people talking about things with each other, and it doesn't necessarily have to happen in a physical space. It doesn't have to have any special physical elements with it. It's all virtual, and or it could be virtual, I guess. And there's nothing unique about virtual meeting versus an in-person meeting. The way there are people that would say the conversation we're having is the same as we would have in person, which I really doubt that. Actually, I think it would be quite a bit different. If nothing else, the latency. I feel like the latency on Zoom is something that we've all adapted to, but this idea that if we both try to start talking in the same millisecond, we can manage that in person a lot better than we can do it on Zoom.
Yeah.
But even little things like that, it's just this, it's almost a coming fundamental disregard for material reality, or the significance of material reality as something important, which is quite a shift from where we were 50 years ago, where material reality was it.
Yeah. And 50 years ago, some churches were on the radio. Really big churches like Robert Schuller, they might be on TV. But 50 years, now the ubiquity of, my mother goes to her own church and then comes home, and because of the time difference, will catch my service and maybe catch a niece's service. And Sunday I was talking to, she's actually the mother of the church planter who's at our facility again, because she goes to her church in the morning and then goes home and tunes in on our church right after that. And it's a strange new world.
Yeah, it really is. And we've run into that with our church as well. We're blessed in that our lead pastor came from a worship arts background, and we just moved into a new facility. So we are more dialed in than we should be regarding technology and lighting and streaming. And like I said, it really does feel like a mini mega church. It's a very high production. The lighting is great. The sound is great. And we get, maybe 300 or 400 people per service. But it's been it's sort of an issue because the live stream is so good, and people had to do the live stream over COVID. And like one of the elders said, it's easier to come to church on your couch in your pajamas. There are going to be people that want to do that into the future.
Yep. I listened, a decade and a half ago, I listened to a lot of Tim Keller sermons, and, there were always some free ones, and then you could pay. They were like $2.50. And, he was quite open with, I don't necessarily want to make my sermons too easy to come by for that very reason. And most people will admit that, oh, coming to church is way better than staying home, but staying home is way easier than coming to church. And right now, especially sort of in this COVID twilight that we're in, where we're open and there's no restrictions and you can come, but others are still staying home. And then every now and then I'm tempted to, let's just cut out the live stream. But then I recognize that there are, especially because of my YouTube channel, there are certain numbers of people that are depending on the live stream. And then the question is, now, am I enabling them to not find a local church? But again, I know that some of them, they go to their local church and then they check out the live stream. So I wouldn't necessarily want to cut that off. And others are living in areas or have health issues or one issue or another where they can't practically actually participate in a physical local church. And because I've had conversations with them. So
yeah. Do you feel the weight of that as a pastor? Because I've listened to some of your other talks regarding, Dunbar number and how it's so important to be able to relate to your people. If there are people that are watching your live stream that, see you as their pastor, but then you're not able to interact with or find out about their life and do the actual, pastoral care type stuff with.
Oh, completely. But it's not. I would have imagined that, well, there'll be tensions between attention for my local people versus the massive number of people on the internet. That's true. But it's also that by virtue of the internet, some people are far more disclosing on Zoom to a pastor. And I can actually do certain work with them that they're probably not doing with their local pastor. Now, should they? Probably. Are they? No. Will they? Maybe never. So it's important that the work get done. And so, like with all of these things, there's all of these situations where I just sort of have to ride it because I can't answer the question. I could be a purist and say, cut it off, but I have too much experience to know that just cutting it off would do damage to other people. And there are goods to be had. So those questions, I live with those questions all the time.
Oh, I can imagine. I mean, even before COVID, before the live stream stuff, I know that's been a criticism and our church is in a growth period. And we've been there through that transition of 150, 200 people. That's a completely different dynamic than even 400 or 500. Now you're into, entrepreneurial organizational dynamics where you're trying to do, things like community groups to now get the numbers back down. But the community group isn't necessarily, you can kind of carry the church culture through it, but there's a relationship that you don't have with the pastor as you encounter those kinds of numbers. And I definitely see that. And I'm a lot more having, living in it and living through it. And I'm actually on the elder board at our church. And so I'm in these meetings and just seeing that dynamic change. I think it's not just growing pains. I think there is something fundamental that does kind of dissolve away as you grow like that. And you can try to reclaim it again, like I said, with organizational dynamics, but it's not the same thing.
No. Madison Square in Grand Rapids, I started attending there when I was in college. And then they were sort of 200, 250 on a Sunday morning. And then within about 3 years, not because I was there, but within about 3 years, they went from like 200, 250 to 1,000. So then there were 2 services on Sunday morning, and then there were 3 services. And then they decided they were going to tear down. They were going to build an additional sanctuary on the site so they figured they could go up to like 1,000, but because of the DNA and the history of many people in the church, they're like, we don't want to be a mega church. So they decided to sort of go up to like 1,000, and then they were going to do church planting. And that was in the 80s when all of this was happening.
Okay.
And so, I look back on it now, and I haven't had a I haven't had real close contact with the church since then, but I have kept in a little bit of contact with the pastor who was my pastor there, and he's just recently retired. So, and a lot of the people who came here to work with me in our church planting phase, a lot of them had also gone through that church. And so I was able to kind of keep tabs. There's no easy answers to any of this in terms of we're going to stay small and we're going to plant new churches. None of those new churches that you plant are going to be like this and are multi-site, and there's just no easy answers. And but all of that has to do with the constraints of physicality,
right?
And
exactly,
and the high texture. And so that's why you have elders, and that's why you wrestle with these questions.
Right.
It's not easy. And there's always trade-offs. And that's again why I say, with respect to the Orthodox, there's no going back.
Yeah.
The church that you were when you were 200 people and now you're 500, that church you had when you were 200 people is gone. It's not coming back. and I deal with that. So my wife and I, during COVID, we had, kids living with us and joblessness and all that stuff. But now for the first time in 30 years, my wife and I are empty nesters.
Nice.
And, my kids who are now in their 20s, they come home now and it's like, oh, and the kids are always kind of like, what's the big deal? And so then I sit down and I say, hey, look, when you were 3, you have, you only have a limited idea of the amount of love and attention and care that we poured into that little 3-year-old. And you know what? That little 3-year-old in some ways is gone. But when I see you, I still see part of that 3-year-old. And so, and this is true of our children, but it's also true of our churches.
Yeah, that's a fascinating way to look at it. I think that's really great. That's it's encouraging. Like I said, I being on the elder board of a church, it's going through a period of growth like that. It's I think that's a great way to look at it.
Yeah. So and that church, and often, especially with churches, you start going there and you fall in love with something because God met you there. And God did a work in your life in that place with those people. You to use this broader language, you had a transformation there. And so that building, that community, that group, that pastor, those songs, that sermon, that's all holy ground.
Yeah.
And so then, when my wife and I were married, we were married in that church. And that church is now the hallway to the main sanctuary. But that church is holy ground in some ways because those sacred moments happened there. And I guess, this is something that when I think about the Christian faith and I think about the work of Christ and the resurrection, I can't figure out how Christ is going to deal with time in that way, but I think he will, because I think the age to come is I don't think we're going to lose the sacredness that we've tasted here. It's not going to be limited. It's certainly going to be purified, but and to me, again, when I think about these things, these are some of the reasons that I am still a Christian, because within Christianity, I see that vision. And I think it's important for churches to, it's when my daughter dropped in last night, and I ran over, and she's not really a hugger so much. And I gave her a hug. She has to tolerate it. And, and I say, yeah, you're going to have to let me love on you a little bit because we're empty nesting and we're doing a little bit of lamenting and mourning and grieving. And so then as church leaders, it's helpful to lament and mourn and grieve. Yeah, that little 200 member church that you fell in love with, that is no more. it's appropriate to lament and mourn and grieve, and in that way honor it, but yet via the resurrection have an understanding that there's something of that holy moment that will not be finally lost, but will be reclaimed and even redeemed and purified, and will become the seed to greater greater things yet to come.
Oh, that's really encouraging. That's really great to hear your perspective on that. That connects a lot of dots for me. I really do appreciate that.
And I think that's the same for our individual journeys, whether you and your wife decide to stay with your current church or move towards Orthodoxy, or even just in your leadership capacity in your church, introduce some of the riches and treasures of Orthodoxy even into your Protestant church, because part of the capacity that Protestants have shown, this is very much an American thing too, as much as the wider culture doesn't like the word, we are going to appropriate some of these things. And I have already appropriated much from Jonathan Peugeot,
Sure.
and from other Orthodox and Roman Catholic and Protestants of other traditions, and even, Jordan Peterson, however we classify him, or John Vervaeke. And Christianity is a religion where, as Jesus' parable says, God reaps where he did not sow.
Yes. Yep. Okay.
And so then, as a leader in that church, you can say, well, I've worked with plenty of leaders before in churches, and sometimes leaders get restless, but and pastors too. But you stay in this church because maybe your wife wants you to stay, or your children are flourishing here, or it's connected to the job or something like this. And there are all kinds of compromises, but you say, okay, but I do have this bend. And so I'm going to take some of these values and gifts, and I'm going to see what we can incorporate here. And again, in terms of Protestants, there's a flexibility within Protestantism that Rod Dreher was recently in town, and there's a church that hosted that little conference, and it's quite a small church. And it was fascinating because after the conference, they had a little communion service, and it was sort of Protestant, it was sort of boomer, it was sort of seeker-ish, but they also are bringing in some sacramentalist things too. And I thought, oh, look at what they're doing here. Look at what they're doing here. And, Protestantism has that flexibility where in maybe Rome or an Orthodox church, it's like, no, this is the discipline. We're not going to do these things because this is who we are. And fair enough. Protestants, it's very American. It's like, here's the canvas.
Yeah.
Especially in non-denominational, it's like, well, we're going to have some icons here. That won't wash in the Christian Reformed Church, but
yeah, it's funny because even before I even knew who Peterson or Peugeot was, even before I recognized, I could articulate the value and symbolism. One of the most powerful moments I remember, this was one of our first experiences with this church, is I believe it was a Good Friday service, I think. And they had everybody in the church write down on a piece of paper, either it was a sin, it was something from your past, just something bad. And we, one by one, had to bring them up to the front, and they had somebody up there that nailed them to a big rugged wooden cross, just nailed everybody's, little pieces of paper. And then I don't know if they burned them after that or shredded them or what, but I just remember how powerful that was. And I remember in that moment thinking, how cool is it that somebody either saw this or had this idea and was able to implement this. It's for Good Friday, which the church we were at, that never would have happened. And so to your point, I think that's, like you said, here's the canvas. What's going to work for our congregation? What's going to, make Christ most glorified in this space with these people? I think that's really cool.
And yet without the detracting from, there's always also beauty and restraint. And so both we appropriate this idea, and then boy, we did it poorly, and we wrote something in it. And, oh
Yeah.
well, we'll maybe not make that mistake again. But I mean,
Yeah.
and in Protestant churches, you're just always experimenting,
Oh,
especially
for
when you're
sure.
going through a growth phase, because it's like,
Yeah.
okay, now we've got to scale this to, maybe 2 or 3 different worship services, and now these 2 different worship services, they're taking on their own spirits too. They have their own angels. They're
Yeah. Right.
the 11 o'clock service is like this, and the 9:30 service
Sure.
is like this, but we're still in one church. And maybe we've got most of our elders going to 9:30, and then, well, who's eldering at 11? And I mean,
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
well, we're about out of time.
Perfect.
Any things? I don't know. I always ask, make sure there's, if there's something like, I really wanted to talk to Paul about this.
No,
So,
this was for 2 reasons. It was really just incredible to have that back and forth. I also wanted to personally, again, say thank you for the time you devote to this. I know that it's not easy to get videos and edit videos, and really just appreciate your perspective as a pastor. And so I don't want to discount that as, somebody who's a member of a congregation. You're not my pastor, but I really do appreciate the perspective and the words, and you're good at what you do.
oh, thank you. Thank you. Is this something that you'd give me permission to share? Or?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, good. Because I'd like to share this, because again, I these conversations are really the favorite part of my channel. I really
Oh, that's
love 'em.
awesome. Yeah.
And I know they're never, I get to see the analytics, and so I know,
Right.
commentary on Jordan Peterson's video with Vervaeke or Peugeot, that gets all the hits.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But this to me is where things are scaled and things are applied, and where the real treasures are. So anyway, well,
Sure.
it's lovely to meet you, Adam. And
Yeah, you too.
and I really, God bless your church and
Oh,
your
thank you.
journey as you and your wife continue to figure things out. And I really appreciate you getting a slot.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, take care of yourself on this
Yeah.
on these happy December.
Yeah, happy December.
Take care.